morning and welcome to Shattering Myths. I am Yahowah. Each weekday morning here on GCN, we expose the destructive myths that are associated with religion and politics, the deadly myths associated with patriotism in the media, and with military and economic schemes. Instead of merely presenting the news, our mission is to understand what is actually occurring behind the headlines, while predicting how these events will shape our world over the next 20 years. Then during our second hour, we're going to engage God on His terms through evidence and reason, since His is the lone reliable voice in an exceedingly troubled world. Our phone number, if you'd like to participate in this discussion over the next 2 hours, is toll-free 877-300-7645. As you heard in the SRN news, there are millions of Egyptians who have taken to the streets, all on the first anniversary of the Islamist president Mohammed Morsi's inauguration. And they are demanding that he resign in the biggest challenge so far to the rule of the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, if you think about this, there's news is reporting that as many as 14 million people came out in protest. 14 million people. The country is about 83 to 84 million overall. About 10% of the population of Egypt is the legacy of Christianity when it first moved into this region. And so there's about 8 to 9 million Coptic Christians. There are of the remaining population, and if you look at the last election, about 65 to 70% of the vote was in favor of the two most fundamentalist Islamic parties. Now, it's interesting, in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood wasn't the most fundamentalist, wasn't the most righteously Islamic party. No, it was the Salaf party. And between the Salaf party, which received about 20 to 25% of the vote, and the Muslim Brotherhood party that received between 45 and 50% of the vote, collectively, they garnered just shy of 70% overall. Now, when you recognize the Coptic Christians would have voted uniformly for non-fundamentalist Islamic parties, and that so would all of those who were pro-democracy, because there is no such thing as democracy in Islam. Islam, as a word in Arabic, means submission. It means surrender. The Quran says there is no choice for a Muslim because Allah has decided their religion. The Quran orders Muslims to follow the dictates of their leaders, whether they be religious or political leaders or military leaders. And so you do the math and you recognize that for some 14 million people to have been protesting the Muslim Brotherhood's rise to power in Egypt, much of it financed and greased by the United States, that's virtually the entirety of the population who doesn't support fundamentalist Islam. It's an astonishing set of circumstances. I suspect, though, it's going to be very much like what happened in Turkey. Remember when about a month or so ago when Turkey was experiencing hundreds of thousands of protesters decrying Erdogan's move in Turkey, where he had taken Turkey to the point that it was now a dictatorship and a Islamic theocracy. He had moved Turkey out of the realm of secular nations into the realm of the many Islamic fundamentalist nations, and they were protesting him. And during that time I said, this is going nowhere. There is no chance for it to gain any traction. Oh, it made the headlines, and it was a splashy story, to be sure, and it took courage on behalf of those who went to the streets. But as I shared with you in Turkey, those who are secular, as opposed to fundamentalist Muslims, are outnumbered by 3 or 4 to 1. There are some 20% of the population in Turkey that would be considered other than fundamentalist Islamic. And so it was not like the rest of the Arab Spring, even though it was presented that way, because what's called the Arab Spring was nothing more than an Islamic Reformation, taking countries that still had a legacy of secular rule, even though it might have been a dictator, and overthrowing the secular dictators to install a theocratic Islamic government. That's what happened in Tunisia. It's what happened in Libya. It's what happened in Egypt. It is what is going to happen in Syria if the world doesn't back down. It's what happened as a result of the United States invading Iraq, giving it to Iran. And so in Turkey, there was no chance that they were going to prevail because they were so outnumbered. You know, if you're protesting on behalf of democracy and you are outnumbered in terms of those who disagree with you 4-1, you have no chance of prevailing through the democratic process. It's what happened in Iraq that caught America's leaders, George W. Bush and company, by just blindsided them. They weren't able to recognize that if you depose the secular dictator Saddam Hussein and you allow one person, one vote, you're going to get an Islamic government that is controlled by the Shias out of Tehran. It's exactly what happened. It was obvious it was going to happen. They outnumbered the Sunnis 3-1. Well, in Turkey, being outnumbered 4-1, those who are calling for democracy have no chance of prevailing through that means. Well, the same thing is true now in Egypt. Even though 14 million people protesting the hijacking of that country, which was once secular, although a dictatorship, which is about the only form of government that has any chance of working in the Islamic world, that even though the United States aided and abetted the transfer of power to a fundamentalist Islamic regime, and that there are 14 million people who would prefer democracy and secular government. It's 84 million people in that country. There's 70 million people who disagree with them. Now, that's not to say that everyone who supports democracy took to the streets. It was a deadly affair. In fact, there was a story that I've seen several snippets of a young American boy, he's not all that young, probably in his early 20s, that was indoctrinated in political correctness and viewed the struggle between the mythical people known as the Palestinians and Israel as a cause célèbre. Fell in love with the culture of the Middle East, which means he had to fall in love with Islam. And so he wanted to be part of the great revival taking place in the Islamic world. He went to Egypt to be part of it. And the very merciless religion that he was beguiled into thinking was good murdered him. He was killed by his own lack of discretion, something that the universities that he attended while growing up here in America took from him. And so now we are in a situation where Egypt is torn asunder. The economy is devastated. America is now funding an Islamic theocracy, arming and equipping it, abetting it. And there are 14 million people taking to the streets to oppose it. And they have no chance whatsoever of success. It's devastating, isn't it? And, you know, the nature of Islam is that it does not accept dissent well. If you look at the history of dissent in Islamic countries, the dissenters are almost always annihilated. And that's ultimately what's going to happen to the dissenters, the secularists, and the Copt Christians in Egypt. It is a sad turn of events, but it is one that was aided and abetted by President Barack Hussein Obama as he began his career as the United States president by making a speech on behalf of the Muslim Brotherhood. And his Secretary of State, Hillary Rotten Clinton, met with and embraced the Muslim Brotherhood. And this is where we are today. There's another story that is related to the Spygate that we've been covering for the last 2 weeks that I'd like to share with you. French President François Hollande said today that the allegations that the U.S. bugged European embassies could threaten the huge planned trade deal that Mr. Hollande said is now off the table. He says there could be no negotiations without guarantees that the spying would stop immediately. The United States government has become paranoid. It knows what most Americans are not willing to accept. Most Americans, unfortunately, are patriotic, and they don't know that their government has become rotten. It is destroying everything that Americans have held dear, that they have created, piece by piece, dismantling the American dream. But when a government becomes rotten, those leading it know. They genuinely know. The congressmen and senators, those involved in the presidential administrations, they know that the country has no hope economically, that it has no hope militarily, that it has no hope with its entitlement programs, that the country's standing is about to collapse. And so there's only one thing left for them, and that's paranoia. Realizing that it's only a matter of time before more and more people recognize that they aren't worthy of their allegiance. They either stop contributing to it, stop participating in the mockery that is democracy, stop playing along. And what happens under those circumstances, when a government becomes paranoid, it begins spying on everyone. We saw it in Nazi Germany with a government as corrupt as any in the world. We see it in Egypt and Saudi Arabia with their religious police. Now we're seeing it in America, spying on its own citizens, turning its own citizens into the enemy, and spying on its friends. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to Shattering Myths. So French President François Hollande, one of my least favorite individuals in the world, is now saying, you know, the revelations that the United States is not only spying on its own citizens, but spying on friendly nations is repulsive. It wasn't the only nation that has been up in arms. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, after he says, hey, you know, it's no big deal. You know, nations always protect their national security. Yeah, you tell me how spying on Americans and spying on the French and spying on the Germans today is protecting your national security. Yeah, can you imagine? We're going to bug the French embassy because, wow, those French, you know, they might attempt to occupy America. I mean, how twisted does your mindset have to be to think that bugging the French embassy is vital to your national interests? I mean, come on. Have we absolutely lost any ability to think rationally? You tell me how PRISM, you know, spying on the keystrokes of Americans and the Verizon wiretap of recording the when and how long and the with whom and the where of telephone conversations of tens of millions of Americans. You tell me, how is that somehow protecting the security of America, particularly when the one place that is responsible for 99.9% of terrorist activity, not only in America but worldwide, was the one place that was off limits to both the telephone tapping and the keystroke tapping. Islamic mosques at direct order by this president. But while we will not investigate, we will not target the mosques, which are responsible for 99.9% of terrorism, we will target the French embassy. It is absolutely pathetic. And yet, here is the U.S. Secretary of State, John Pathetic Kerry, saying, oh, it's no big deal. This is what nations do to protect their national security. It's not unusual. Well, German Chancellor Angela Merkel said bugging friends is unacceptable. The allegations of U.S. security services bugging U.S. missions and embassies of friendly countries throughout Europe, including the French, the Italian, and the Greek embassies. Think about that. You're going to bug the Italian and the Greek embassies in addition to the French. What on earth are we thinking? Do you know that if the French and Italian and Greeks were all to amass every weapon that they have at their disposal, and they were to find some way to get all of that weaponry to the east coast of the United States, what would they do with it? I mean, I can see them going into Napa. There's good wine there. What would be the motivation? Where's the means? It is utterly stupid. Well, Edward Snowden has been charged in the U.S. with theft of government property, unauthorized communication of national defense information. National defense. I thought he was working for the CIA and the NSA. He wasn't working for the Defense Department. And willful communication of classified communications intelligence. You tell me where there is a intersection of intelligence and spying on your own people as if they were the enemy. Intelligence and spying on the French, the Italians, and the Greeks as if they were a threat to national security. He is believed to be at an airport transit lounge in Moscow and is seeking a destination safe from prosecution by the U.S. authorities, who are the real criminals in this case. Green parties in France and Germany have called on their governments to offer Mr. Snowden asylum. Quote, someone like that should be protected, said the leader of Germany's Green Party. He should get a safe haven here in Europe because he has done us a service by revealing a massive attack on European citizens and companies. Germany is part of Europe, could do that for him. They won't, but they should. Boy, it's amazing when socialist parties make more sense than anyone speaking on behalf of the United States. Snowden, himself 30, I believe now, many articles have him at 29, I believe he's 30 years old, said that he had an obligation to free people from oppression. And when you spy, as like the Gestapo did, on your own countrymen, as America has done, then you are being oppressed. It is a form of oppression, and he's right, he did have an obligation to do what he did. We'll return to Shattering Myths and an interesting story on Snowden and his revelations in a moment. Welcome back to Shattering Myths. Mr. Snowden, as many know, told the Guardian newspaper, quote, the NSA has built an infrastructure that allows it to intercept almost everything. Now, if you built an infrastructure to intercept almost everything from every citizen of your country and people around the world, what is the likelihood that it will be used? One of the issues I have with the U.S. having the drones, it's only a matter of time before those drones are used in America. And because the drones have the opportunity to kill as in addition to spy, that's how they'll be used. The problem with the United States having a military that's larger than the rest of the world's militaries combined is that the tendency is to use it. And so when you recognize that governments which are bankrupt, like the United States, don't build things they don't intend to use, the whole nature of what the NSA has done is specifically designed to, as Snowden says, has built an infrastructure that allows it to intercept almost everything. With this capability, the vast majority of human communications are automatically ingested without targeting. You know, the response of the government has been, that we're not targeting average Americans, we're targeting foreigners, and it's okay because we're protecting you from terrorism. That's an absolute lie. They aren't targeting foreign nationals. They're not targeting anyone. And the only people that would be meaningful to target, which would be Muslims congregating in mosques, they're specifically excluding. There is no targeting here. That's the whole nature of it. It is search and seizure without cause, direct violation of the U.S. Constitution. Mr. Snowden did not believe that he had committed a crime, nor do I, nor would anyone who is moral. We have seen enough criminality, I should say. Well, you can say that I wasn't chosen for this job because of my diction. We have seen enough criminality on part of the government. It is hypocritical to make this allegation against me, said Snowden. Truer words could not have been spoken. The criminal here is Barack Hussein Obama, George W. Bush, Dianne Feinstein. The heads of these organizations like the NSA, the National Security Advisors, the head of the CIA, they are the criminals. They wantonly, knowingly, purposefully violated the rule of law of the U.S. Constitution, committing a crime that should cause them all not only to be impeached, but to be jailed. And yet the nation, instead of holding the heads of these organizations accountable, the President of the United States accountable for impeaching Barack Hussein Obama and taking George W. Bush to trial, is seeking to extradite the man who exposed their criminality. The Guardian reported a U.S. secret court ordered phone company Verizon to hand over NSA records on millions, tens of millions of telephone calls of average Americans called metadata. The metadata included the numbers of both phones that were involved in every call, the duration of that call, the time of that call, the date of the call, and the location. For mobile phones, it's determined by which mobile signal towers relayed the call or text. Then, the next day, the Washington Post and the Guardian said that the NSA had also tapped directly into the servers of 9 internet firms, including Facebook, Google, Microsoft, and Yahoo, to track online communications in a program known as PRISM. It wasn't national security that was harmed by these revelations. It was the credibility of the U.S. government. So the U.S. Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper. James Clapper is the same fellow that interviewed David Headley, the man, the lone survivor of the Mumbai terrorist attacks in India, who at the time was working for the CIA and DEA, as well as the Pakistani ISI and Lashkar-e-Taiba, the Islamic terrorist organization. Interesting group, right? He's working for the DEA, the CIA, the Pakistani ISI, and Lashkar-e-Taiba, all to plot a terrorist attack that killed nearly 200 people in India. He's the fellow that signed off releasing him of culpability when both wives claimed to have been beaten by him and spilled the beans, saying this is what he's planning on doing. They were explicit. He is planning a terrorist attack in Mumbai, India. Here are the specific targets that he is planning to assault. It was James Clapper that decided to do nothing, including not even warn India that the attack was coming. He is amongst the most repulsive individuals in the world today, James Clapper. And yet Clapper is the one who is defending PRISM and defending the Verizon wiretaps. He says, oh, you know, you shouldn't be bothered because all this was done with the approval of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act and the Foreign Surveillance Court, which of course is completely secret and has not disapproved of anything. It isn't even a good rubber stamp. It's just a guise. PRISM was authorized under changes to U.S. surveillance and laws passed under George W. Bush. So how can you be so troubled with us? This is George W. Bush's doing. Of course, it was renewed under Barack Hussein Obama. Mr. Obama then defended the surveillance program. There was a listing of some major U.S. security leaks that was published by CNN. The first on the list was the Pentagon Papers, 1971. Daniel Ellsberg. He leaked a study showing that the government had foreknowledge that it was unlikely to prevail in the Vietnam War. 1971. This is identical to the articles that I've shared with you regarding the Afghanistan war. You see, we now know for certain that LBJ, in a conversation with McNamara, who was his Secretary of Defense, within 6 months of the time that he took office and within a time that fewer than a few hundred Americans had died in Vietnam, he is on a recorded, and the recording now is at the University of Virginia. You can listen to it, the Freedom of Information Act. He's having a conversation with McNamara, and he says, you know, it's obvious that the Gulf of Tonkin incident did not occur, that it was a bloody lie. That's how America justified invading Vietnam. Said it didn't occur, it was a lie. Just like George W. Bush's claim that Saddam Hussein had purchased tons of yellow cake uranium and was building a nuclear bomb. It was a lie. And that was the justification for us invading Iraq. He said, okay, it's a bloody lie. And he says there is no chance that we can win this war. But he justified staying in the war because of his own personal ego, telling McNamara that Americans would never accept or forgive a president who retreated in defeat. And so because of his legacy and his ego, Lyndon Baines Johnson, over 60,000 Americans died in Vietnam, making a bad situation worse for nothing. The same is true with the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. Papers were released by WikiLeaks that showed the United States government internal documentation showing that there is no way to prevail in either of those wars. None. And yet we stay. Americans continue to die. We continue to spill blood and coin. Well, the first to do that was Daniel Ellsberg. He was attacked viciously by the administration, even by the media. He was, rather than being held up as a hero, showing that we need to get out of the Vietnam War now because it's a lost cause. It isn't merciful. It isn't moral to send new boys and girls to die for those that have already died for nothing. Of course, there was Watergate in 1972. Now, those guys have been heralded, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. That was the burglary of the Democratic National Committee headquarters. Iran-Contra affair was another government embarrassment and a security link. The Iranian cleric reveals illegal U.S. arms sales to Iran, the proceeds of which are used to fund the Nicaraguan Contras. Both causes were bad, but the United States, saying they would never negotiate with terrorists, sent missiles to the Iranian regime to free the U.S. hostages. Well, Ronald Reagan orchestrated it. Then there was the Valerie Plame revelation in 2003. This time, Joe Wilson, who had firsthand knowledge that the President of the United States lied when he said that the Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq had purchased tons of yellow cape uranium from Nigeria. He not only knew that he lied, he went and did an investigation himself, going to Nigeria and meeting with everyone of consequence, and proved conclusively that the President of the United States knowingly lied at the time, that he was aware of the truth and chose to lie anyway. And so George W. Bush and his administration revealed that his wife was an undercover CIA agent, ending her career. And yet no one in the United States government was held accountable except a lowly aide for the vice president. Libby was his name. Then, of course, there was Abu Ghraib in 2004, with the publication of pictures that showing that the United States had authorized the torture of captured enemy combatants. Now, in that case, rather than the President of the United States, who had signed off on the order, and the Attorney General of the United States, who had signed off on the order, being held accountable for breaching international law, no, we put individual servicemen in jail for the malfeasance of others. They were doing nothing but following orders. And then, of course, there is Brady Manning in 2010. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to Shattering Myths. We're talking about the U.S. security leaks. The Bradley Manning is the most interesting to me. He, through WikiLeaks, downloaded thousands of classified documents from military servers. In 2010, he's now being tried. The realization with Bradley Manning is that he did the nation one of the greatest services in its history. He provided everything you need to know to recognize that the U.S. government ought not be revered. You ought not be patriotic. You ought not be political. There is, if you're going to vote, you're voting for perhaps the lesser of two evils, but we're talking about tremendously evil and rotten to the core. He revealed that the U.S. military is not something that we should revere, but instead it is deployed doing awful things in the world, actually is counterproductive to America's security. Those documents were America's last best hope of realizing that we're being bamboozled by an extraordinarily evil group of people. And yet, rather than treasure the insights that were provided, America was beguiled into demonizing the source. Same thing is true with Snowden. Now, there's a story that I'm going to begin today, and we'll carry on at least through tomorrow. In a roundtable discussion, a trio of former National Security Agency whistleblowers told USA Today that Edward Snowden's succeeded where they had failed. You see, Snowden wasn't the first person to reveal that the United States government, through its NSA, was in grotesque violation of the Fourth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Three individuals, their names are Thomas Drake, William Binney, and Kirk Wiebe, have been doing this for a better part of a decade. They have been harassed by the U.S. government, and the media paid them no heed. They attempted to do this through the proper channels. They went to their supervisors and said, this is wrong, what we're doing is criminal. They were not only ignored, their careers were destroyed. They then went to senators and congressmen and spilled the beans, saying that what is being done by the NSA is criminal, in direct violation to the U.S. Constitution. And senators and congressmen yawned. And so they went to the media, and the media refused to tell their story. Well, we're going to tell their story because it was finally reported when a national security agency contractor revealed top-secret details this month on the government's collection of Americans' phone and internet records, one select group of intelligence veterans breathed a sigh of relief. Thomas Drake, William Binney, and Kirk Wiebe were those who belonged to a select fraternity, the NSA, and were officials, this article says from USA Today, who paved the way. No, they didn't pave the way, but they certainly attempted to do what Snowden did. For years, the three whistleblowers had told anyone who would listen that the NSA collects huge swaths of communication data from U.S. citizens. They had spent decades in the top ranks of the agency, designing and managing the very data collection systems that they say had been turned against Americans. That is a sobering realization, isn't it? These three individuals were not employees of an employment agency. They weren't new to the NSA. They weren't low-level fellows. They were senior officers, and they actually built the very mechanism that is destroying our liberty. And they spent decades not only designing the systems, but acknowledging that those systems had been turned against America. So if Snowden is charged with treason, then it's an admission by the U.S. government that the enemy of the U.S. government are the American people themselves. When they became convinced that fundamental constitutional rights were being violated, the Fourth Amendment, completely trashed, they compiled first to their superiors, then to federal investigators, then to congressional oversight committees, and then finally to the news media, what they knew for certain was being done because they were the ones who had built the mechanism. You hear that order of things? They told their supervisors, and their supervisors did nothing to honor the U.S. Constitution. They told it to federal investigators who did nothing. They told it to congressional oversight committees who did nothing.